Hey, good afternoon, and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. And this afternoon, we're going to start our second half of our study in Matthew 16, 27, and 28. And what I mean by our second half is that up to this point, we've focused on the Old Testament source for Matthew 16, 27, and 28. Going forward, we're going to emphasize and focus on the New Testament usage of Matthew 16, 27, and 28 as it relates to the second coming of Christ. Now, up to this point, as I've said in our last 28 or 29 videos, we showed you that Matthew 16, 27, and 28 and the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom drew from Old Testament prophecy, which prophesied the second coming of Christ. And what that meant was that Jesus, in speaking of his coming, to reward every man according to their deeds and to establish his kingdom, in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, spoke of his second coming in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and placed it within the lifetime of his first century disciples. Going forward, just to reiterate, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how Jesus himself, later in his ministry, and how the writers of the New Testament drew from and used Matthew 16, 27 and 28 as their source for the second coming of Christ, which they also place in the lifetime of their own first century generation. So this video will just simply be an outline of the ground we're going to cover in our second half of this study, and the New Testament sources, including Jesus's prophecies in the Gospels following Matthew 16, 27, and 28 that we're going to cover in these lessons are these. We're gonna see that Jesus in Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 drew from his own prophecy in Matthew 16, 27, and 28, prophesying the second coming of Christ at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And we're gonna, although Matthew 13 is not does not draw from Matthew 16, we're gonna hit that that prophecy up as well, just because it's so important to New Testament eschatology. Now, from there, we're going to leave Jesus. We're going to go to Paul. We're going to see how Paul drew from Matthew 16, 27, and 28 in his eschatology. And specifically, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 15, 51 through 54, 1 Thessalonians 4, 15 through 17. We're going to look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, 4 through 10. We're going to look at 1 Timothy 4, 1. And we're going to look finally at the Apostle John once we're done with Paul. And we're going to look at how John in the Apocalypse, that is in the book of Revelation, drew from Matthew 16, 27, 28, in Revelation 1, 7, and Revelation 22, 6 through 12. And we're going to show you that Jesus, Paul, and John, all drawing from the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 16, 27, and 28, prophesied the second coming of Christ and placed it in their lifetime. What that means is that Matthew 16, 27, and 28, in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and in anticipation of New Testament prophecy, prophesied the second coming of Christ, which Jesus himself placed, as well as the prophets, as well as the writers of the New Testament, in the lifetime of his own disciples. Well, that was a brief video. That's where we're going in the next handful of videos. It's going to be good. And this overall study, as I said in the beginning, will give you, the listener, the understanding and the infallible, not by me, but by Scripture, the infallible, irrefutable arguments and evidence placing the second coming of Christ in the first century generation at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. We'll see you next time. God bless. Have a great week. Bye for now.